My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 70 years old, and just last year I lost my husband, Tom, after more than 4 decades of marriage. People assume grief is about tears, about nights of crying into pillows. But what really surprised me was how it showed up in the smallest routines. For me, grief looked like standing in the kitchen every morning, realizing I no longer had to set out 2 coffee cups. It was making coffee for one. After the funeral, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I imagined time would move slowly but gently, that my son Dan and his wife Melissa would step in with care. Instead, I found myself on a trip to Rome I hadn't planned, walking into the lobby of the Hotel Aurelia with my suitcase dragging behind me. I remember the concierge looking at me with a kind of pity I couldn't place at first, as Dan handled everything at the desk. His smile was too polished, his signature on the paperwork too rehearsed. When he slipped the room key into my hand, I felt a chill rather than comfort. My son told the staff I preferred peace and quiet, yet I never asked for silence. What I had wanted was a room with a view of the city lights, something alive to hold on to in my first real adventure without Tom. Instead, I was led down a hushed hallway into an old wing where my window faced a closed courtyard. That was my first sign that something about this trip wasn't what it seemed. Back in Denver, the house felt like a shell of the life Tom and I had built together. Every corner carried echoes of us, the couch where we planned vacations, the kitchen where we laughed over burnt toast, the garden he loved to tend. After his funeral, I kept moving through those rooms as if I were a guest in my own life. I told myself I was coping well enough. I celebrated small victories like walking through the grocery store without tears or finishing a full day without collapsing into bed from exhaustion. But underneath, I was still fragile, raw in ways I didn't admit out loud. Dan began visiting more often, sometimes with Melissa at his side. At first, I thought they were simply looking out for me, but over time, I realized their presence wasn't about comfort, it was about control. Melissa walked through my kitchen like she owned it, rearranging things, commenting on what I should or shouldn't be eating. Dan would steer our conversations toward what he called healthy change, suggesting I break routines, try something new, even leave the house for an extended trip. When they brought up Italy, it felt odd. Melissa had never shown much interest in other cultures, yet suddenly she spoke with confidence about Mediterranean food and art. I remember sitting there, staring at the familiar walls of my living room, and feeling the weight of their enthusiasm press against me. It didn't sound like an offer. It sounded like a decision already made. And so I found myself in Rome, standing in the marble lobby of the Hotel Aurelia, watching Dan slip my credit card to the concierge without even looking back at me. He arranged everything with a kind of polished charm that might have fooled strangers, but not me. My instincts told me this was more than a family vacation. That night, when I settled into the so-called peaceful room, I felt boxed in. No view of the city, no chance to watch the lights of Rome twinkle as I had imagined. Just silence, walls that seemed too thick, and a window facing nothing but stone. Lying there, I wondered, was this really about helping me heal? Or was something else already in motion? Early the next morning in Rome, I woke to a buzzing phone. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. The words were simple, but cut straight through me. Leave quietly. Don't trust them. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. My chest tightened as if the air had thinned, and I sat frozen on the edge of the bed. I couldn't make sense of it. Who would send me something like that? And why now? thousands of miles from home. Still, I felt the warning settle deep inside me, and I couldn't shake it off. I began scanning my room with sharper eyes. That was when I noticed the small things. My suitcase zipper was pulled in the opposite direction than I remembered. My toiletries were lined up just slightly differently, as if a stranger's hand had touched them. Even my purse, which I had left neatly by the nightstand, was shifted just enough that I knew it wasn't me. A second message came. It told me that the appointment I was supposed to attend with Dan and Melissa was a trap, that they wanted me to sign papers I wouldn't understand. It also said I should trust only one person, Nora Price, Tom's old business partner. My heart ached, remembering her kindness at his funeral. If she was somehow behind these warnings, I needed to pay attention. Fear ran through me, but so did clarity. I couldn't stay where I was. I needed to move before Dan and Melissa returned to collect me for breakfast. So, I forced myself to act calm. I told them I felt a little unwell and might need some air. I wandered the gardens as if I were only stretching my legs, walking the perimeter to make my movements look predictable. Then, when the moment felt right, I slipped quietly through a side gate that opened onto the busy Roman streets. The crowd of tourists swallowed me up, and for the first time since the trip began, I felt something like freedom. My heart was pounding, but I knew one thing with certainty: whatever this family trip was supposed to be, it was no vacation. It was a setup, and now I had to find out why. I ducked into a small cafe a few blocks away from the hotel. The smell of strong espresso grounded me, and I sat at a corner table, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a text, it was a call. When I saw Nora Price's name appear on the screen, my heart steadied just a little. Nora had been Tom's business partner years ago, a woman I remembered for her sharp mind and her kindness. At his funeral, her words of comfort had felt genuine, not like the polite formalities I'd heard from so many others. Hearing her voice in that moment was like catching sight of a lifeline in stormy water. She told me she had been contacted by Dan only weeks earlier. He had asked her strange questions about Tom's supposed investments in Italy, investments she knew never existed. And then, he started probing about me, about whether I seemed confused, forgetful, or unable to handle finances. She admitted she didn't like where his questions were leading, and she had decided to keep an eye on things from a distance. Now, she was warning me to be careful. Her certainty shook me awake. This wasn't about a vacation. It wasn't even about grief. It was about control, about money, about taking my independence from me under the disguise of helping. I needed help beyond what one friend could give me. So I made my way to the U.S. Embassy in Rome. The building itself was intimidating: thick walls, guards at the entrance, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in days: safety. A consular officer named Lauren Pierce listened to my story with calm attention. She didn't rush me. She didn't make me feel dramatic. Instead, she laid out what she believed was happening. She explained how some families try to push seniors into signing legal papers in foreign countries, knowing the laws can move faster there. She described emergency guardianship, a process that could hand over control of my finances to Dan with nothing more than a court stamp and a few manipulated records. Her words chilled me, but they also gave me clarity. For the first time, I saw the shape of the plan. It wasn't vague suspicion anymore. It was a scheme with steps, with structure, and with dangerous consequences if I didn't act. Lauren helped me contact Alan Brooks, the attorney who had handled Tom's estate back in Chicago. His voice over the phone was sharp and urgent, filled with energy, as if he'd been waiting for this call. He told me not to sign anything, not to return to the hotel, and not to let my son control my whereabouts. He promised to connect with Italian legal partners immediately. Sitting in that embassy office, I realized something important. My instincts had been right all along. I wasn't imagining the unease. I wasn't just a grieving widow losing her sense of judgment. I was a woman being cornered, and now I finally had people who believed me. That knowledge steadied me. I was ready to fight, but I had no idea just how deep their plan went. Alan arrived in Rome less than a day later, looking worn from travel but steady with purpose. Alongside him was Marco Turini, an Italian lawyer who specialized in family law. They spread papers across a table inside the embassy conference room, and I remember feeling as if my life had been reduced to folders and dates. Piece by piece, the truth began to unfold. Dan hadn't just started this scheme in the weeks after Tom's funeral. He had been preparing for months, even before Tom passed away. They showed me private investigator reports pages documenting my daily routines. Missed trash day was recorded as evidence of diminished capacity. A neighbor's offhand comment about me seeming tired was written down as a sign of mental decline. Even the grief itself, my silence in the grocery store or moments of distraction, was twisted into proof that I could no longer manage my own life. I stared at those pages and felt sick. It was humiliating to see myself written out in cold language, as if I were a case study instead of a human being. But what struck me most was how deliberate it all was. This wasn't sloppy or rushed. It was careful, methodical, calculated. Marco leaned over one report and pointed to a timeline. Dan had reached out to multiple elder law firms back in the States, asking about guardianship, long before he ever suggested a family trip. The more I listened, the more I realized my instincts had been right. Italy was never about healing. It was about isolation. He wanted me away from familiar doctors, away from friends who might question his story, and in a legal system where he thought he could move faster. And then came the final insult. A psychiatrist, Dr. Mitchell Reed, had been arranged to evaluate me. He appeared at the embassy soon after, speaking in a tone meant to sound reassuring, but in my mind, I heard only condescension. He hadn't asked about my health records. He hadn't run a single test. He was prepared to build his judgment entirely off what my son and daughter-in-law told him. For the first time since Tom's death, I felt my old strength returning. I looked at the timeline Alan had prepared, and I reminded myself of the facts I knew to be true. Only 3 weeks earlier, Dan had praised me for handling grief with resilience. At the same time, he was already sending emails about my supposed decline. The contradiction was clear, and I realized I could use their own story against them. It was a strange kind of relief. Every lie they had built left a paper trail, and those papers were now in front of me. They thought they had written my weakness, but in reality, they had documented their own deception. That knowledge gave me courage. The fight was no longer just about defending myself. It was about exposing the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored. And soon, I would have the chance to do exactly that in front of a judge. The morning of the hearing, I walked into the Rome courthouse with my head held higher than it had been in months. The building itself was smaller than I expected, but the weight of what was about to happen made the air feel heavy. Dan and Melissa were already there, seated with their lawyer. Dan wore the mask of a worried son, while Melissa dabbed her eyes with the kind of tears that appeared on cue. For years, I had wanted to believe their emotions were real. But that morning, I finally saw them for what they were: tools, staged expressions to sell a story. Our side of the room felt different. Alan stood beside me, steady and firm, while Marco laid out the evidence with calm precision. Page by page, he revealed the timeline private investigator reports that began before Tom had even passed away. Consultations with elder law firms. The carefully chosen hotel room meant to make me appear disoriented. The psychiatric evaluation arranged without my consent. I sat quietly, listening as my life was dissected in front of strangers. But this time, I did not feel diminished. With every piece of evidence, the truth came into sharper focus. This wasn't about protecting me. It was about exploiting me. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I reminded the judge of the reality of my life, that I had cared for a husband through illness, managed finances for decades, and had navigated international legal counsel in the span of just days. I let the contrast hang in the air. The woman they described as incompetent was standing right there, organizing her own defense. The judge's eyes were sharp, and though she spoke only briefly, her decision was swift. Dan's petition for guardianship was denied. Not only that, the entire case was being referred to Italian prosecutors for fraud, and a restraining order would prevent them from taking any further legal action against me for 5 years. As the gavel fell, I felt a release I can hardly describe. Relief, yes, but also sorrow, because in that moment, I knew with certainty my own son had chosen deceit over love. I thought the battle was over then, but I was wrong. There was still another layer of betrayal waiting to be uncovered, one that would strike even deeper. That evening, just when I thought the worst had already been dragged into the light, Alan and Marco asked me to sit down again. Their faces were heavier than before, and I knew something else was coming. They showed me a folder of emails, exchanges between Dan and Tom's oncologist. My hands trembled as I read them. Dan had been pressing the doctor to scale back treatments, suggesting that continuing was unnecessary, even selfish. He pushed for hospice care, claiming it would be better for Tom, less painful, more dignified. But I knew my husband. I remembered the way his eyes lit up when the doctor told him the treatments were helping, that we might have more time. He wanted to fight. Seeing those emails broke something inside me. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about Tom's life. The insurance had covered most of the costs, so the argument about expenses didn't make sense. What did make sense, as horrifying as it was that Dan wanted to shorten the fight, to bring the end sooner, so the inheritance would be closer. I thought back to those final weeks. I had been so exhausted from caregiving, so overwhelmed by grief, that I let Dan step in for a few appointments. I told myself he was helping me carry the weight. But reading those messages, I realized he hadn't been helping at all. He had been steering decisions, pushing the doctor toward comfort care. And Tom, my husband of 42 years, may have gone to his death believing his own son was ready for him to let go. The betrayal settled deeper than anything I'd felt before. My son hadn't just tried to rob me of my independence, he had tampered with the final stretch of his father's life. I sat in silence for a long time, letting that truth burn through me. And in that silence, I made another promise to myself: if Dan was willing to go this far, then he needed to face every consequence of what he had done. The final confrontation was waiting, and I knew I had to meet it head on. When I finally returned to my hotel later that week, Dan and Melissa were waiting in the lobby with their suitcases stacked beside them. They looked worn down, smaller somehow, as if the weight of their own choices had finally started to crush them. For a moment, I felt that old instinct rise up, the urge to comfort, to fix, to make things better. But I pushed it down. Family is supposed to protect your freedom, not strip it away. I told myself the truth I had avoided for too long. My son had crossed a line I could never uncross for him. He had chosen greed over loyalty, manipulation over love. From that day on, he would have to face the consequences of those choices without me softening the blow. 6 months later, I found myself in Umbria, sitting on the terrace of a small apartment I had bought with my own money. The olive trees stretched into the hills, the sun warming my shoulders as I read an email from Alan confirming that justice was moving forward. I had also started a small foundation to help other seniors who felt trapped by financial abuse from those closest to them. If you've ever felt concern disguised as control, know this: you are not alone, and you are not powerless. Share your story in the comments, because your voice might be the light someone else needs today. And if my story stayed with you, I'd be grateful if you liked this video and passed it along. Together, we can make sure dignity is never taken for granted.